The thing about Mark's gospel is this. Mark's gospel, he is not a disciple like the original 12. Mark is going to write a gospel based on what he hears Peter say. And that's what most scholars think is Mark spends time with Peter and he's listening to the stories and then he's writing down the story from the source. So Mark would be like the first newspaper journalist, you might say. Where Matthew is writing his experience, Mark is writing, he's like the first gospel journalist. He's writing down the first-hand account. He's the biographer, you might say, for Peter writing this account. So the author of the book of Mark is also known as John Mark. In passages of the Bible, Mark was his Roman name and John was his Jewish name. So that happened a lot with individuals would have two different types of names because they have a heritage family name and then they have like a Roman name, a political name, you might say, like Rome's in charge, and so we want everyone to have Roman names. But then people go, but whatever. I'm Jewish heritage, so I want this. Or someone says, your name's. When I took Spanish, and I had to have a Spanish name, and so many names were picked, and my name was Tordeo. That was my Spanish name, Theodore. And so in Spanish, we had to call each other by a Spanish name, so I was Theodore in there, but outside I was Steve. That was my English name. So it's kind of the same idea. In Acts chapter 12, it says, when this had dawned on him, he went down to the house of Mary, the mother of John, and also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. So we see Mark moving in the story of Acts. Number 2 is this. Mark will write primarily to a Roman audience, as evidenced by his explanation of many Jewish customs. So Mark's going to write to an audience that doesn't have the background information that Matthew's audience has. That's why Matthew can talk so much about Jesus fulfilling prophecy, because they understood the Old Testament text. But Mark is writing to an audience who doesn't understand. They don't know the Jewish history, and so if you're really hammering that, they would be like, doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know any of that and don't care about any of that. So Mark is going to take a different approach as he talks about who Jesus is. Number 3 is this. Mark was not one of the original 12. I already said that. But rather he's traveling companion of Paul and Peter and also a cousin of Barnabas. And it's because of Mark's actions that caused Paul and Barnabas to split, because Mark doesn't stay with them on that first missionary journey. He makes one hop to an island, and then for whatever reason he loses heart and goes home. And we don't know that, but that was enough to make Paul pretty upset. And Paul's like, he doesn't want to give him a second chance. And Barnabas is interesting because Barnabas is the guy of second chances. And he gave Paul a second chance. But now Paul won't give Mark a second chance. And so that really, you can see, that really frustrated Paul. And Paul and Barnabas split, and they go separate ways. And so this dynamic duo goes separate ways. They both love the Lord, but they just couldn't see eye to eye on that issue. And Paul's pride probably was hurt in that. And Barnabas was upset because he wanted to extend grace, I think, in that situation. And so Paul takes Silas and he goes on. And then, eventually they go to Philippi and he sings in the midnight hour. And Barnabas takes Mark and they go in the other direction. There's a couple key verses there. I'll let you read those on your own. Number 4 then is this. John Mark was the cause of a great divide between Paul. I just mentioned that. Because he leaves in the middle of that first missionary journey. Paul does recant a little bit when he will say later, it's not so much that he was wrong, but he asks for John Mark's help. Bring John Mark, for I have great value with him. In Acts 15:37, Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, but Paul did not think it was wise to take him because he had deserted in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work, and they had such a disagreement that they parted company, and Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. So here's where Paul comes back around in 2 Timothy 4:11. Only Luke is with me. Now, when he's writing 2 Timothy, Paul's about ready to die. And this is where those passages, for I'm already being poured out like a drink offering, and my time for my departure is at near, and those kind of statements there. And in that, he writes, only Luke's with me. Get Mark and bring him with you because he is helpful to me in my ministry. I'd like to think that Paul apologized. I don't know if he did, but this is about as close as we see in Scripture where Paul says, I didn't see it in him, but there was some great value in him. And it just took a little bit of maturing, and maybe it took somebody else to cultivate that out of him which Barnabas does, and then Paul realizes, he turned out okay. Sometimes we meet people like that where we go, all right, when you were a crazy kid, That's why the Bible talks about there's no honor for a prophet in his own hometown. And I would never go back to my hometown to preach. I went and preached one time for them, and I was not asked to preach again. And I don't think it's because I was bad. It was because after I got done preaching, one of the elders offered me the job of being the preacher at the church. And they said, we'd really like to have you come back and be our preacher. And then when the actual preacher came back, I think he was upset with that, so they didn't ask me back. But I said I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't even consider that because I grew up in that church and they seen how I was as a kid and all the things I got into. And I would always be little Steve, who was the little preacher boy and that sort of thing there. And there's always that kind of struggle when you grow up in a church. Unless the church drastically changes, you're always that little person, in the church and stuff like that. And I see it with my own daughter. I mean, my daughter came here and a lot of people, I'm just throwing Leon under the bus here, but not that he's ever said this, but he remembers when Katie was the little 5-year-old singing Happy Birthday Jesus. And though she's 16 now and leading worship, I bet if you asked him, he probably sees her. I remember the little girl that was singing Happy Birthday Jesus when we first got here and that sort of thing there. And she could be a grown woman of 30 years old, but when she would come back, Leon and others are going to go, I remember when you sang Happy Birthday Jesus when you were 5, because sometimes people don't let us grow up and mature, and it's only maybe when we go somewhere else where we don't have some of that stigma that we can do what we need to do. Remember Jesus, it says he couldn't do many miracles in his own hometown, and it wasn't because he wasn't able to do miracles, it was because they had a lack of faith. And sometimes someone can come and they can't lead. It's not because they don't have the ability to lead, because people won't let them lead. They won't follow them because they will always see them as something else. And that's why sometimes we go to new places to start over, so we can go, I want to go where nobody knows my name, kind of thing like that. So anyway, they didn't invite me back to preach, but I remember preaching there and stuff. But I remember saying that because it was interesting when I got done preaching and I walked down. I was in Bible college and I had already been doing some itinerary preaching around, and I had this little lady come up and she says, "Oh, someday you're just going to make a fine preacher." And I'm like, I'm already doing this now. It doesn't. When will I make that fine preacher? I bet if she saw me today, she'd probably say, "Someday you're going to make a fine preacher." So I got some people you need to tell that to. I don't know. They disagree. John Mark. All right. Anyway, number 5. Mark's gospel does not follow a chronological order of events of Jesus. I talked about this when I started introing into Matthew, that not all the Gospels follow through a chronological order, and they write down stories that they see as being important. So even from the earliest of church leaders, his account was seen as completely truthful and authoritative. You can see writings of that. I've made a little footnote here. Some of you don't know who these people are. But Eusebius is an early church father around the 300s, later 300s, 375. We have some writing of him where he is talking and quoting the Gospel of Mark. Papias before him, and he would be the first generation after what we call the Apostolic Fathers. And then we have, so you got you got Matthew and John, these guys who actually walked with Jesus, and then you have the guys that they sat under. And so, or in the early 100s, they would have sat under John's writing, or they would have sat under Paul's teaching, and those people. And those people, Papias is one of those, and he's quoting this in here. The name I was forgetting last week, by the way, was Polycarp. When I said there was a P name, and he was in his 80s. And anyway, it was Polycarp. Some of you are like, what? Go back and watch the video. Let me just, I don't want to read it for you, but you can read the little quote there that Eusebius quotes Papias in here talking about Mark, and I just wanted you to see that. I put that stuff in there because sometimes we forget to realize the volume of literary evidence that we have for the historicity of the Bible and the Word of God. Some people think that we believe in this antiquated book and it's just a fairy tales and all, but there's more documentation about the letters and stuff of this book than any other ancient writing we have, than any other ancient writing, by far, to show that what we have are legitimate copies and things like that. And so that's why I put some of those things in there. Number 6 then is this. Mark's gospel has a strong emphasis on the supernatural powers of Jesus, proving his deity. This is interesting because Mark is writing to a Roman audience. Well, what do the Romans believe in? They believe in pagan gods, right? And so they have these great temples and stuff, like the great temple that was in Ephesus, a massive temple, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world because of the columns that it had. I think it was like 127 of these stone columns that were 60 feet tall. Now, you can look in this building here. I think the very peak of our building right here is about 28 feet. So take the size of this, double that. That's the height of these columns that were in Ephesus, 127 of them, to the temple Diana or Artemis, depending on whether it's a Greek name or the Roman name on here. But they have all these gods. And so she's a god of fertility, and there's all kinds of carvings of her and different things like that, grotesque kind of carvings and whatnot that go along with the idea of bringing fertility to the culture and to the people and that sort of thing. So Mark wants them to understand that Jesus is deity, that he is God, and he's above all these other things that you're worshiping. So how does he show that? He shows that at his baptism. In Mark 1:19, at that time, Jesus came from Nazareth, Galilee, was baptized by John in the Jordan. And as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he said he saw heaven being torn open, and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And the voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." Mark wants them to be reminded of this was seen. Jesus was being baptized. There was some disturbance that was taking place in the atmosphere that looked like it was being torn apart. Maybe it was clouds being separated, and the Spirit comes down, which is not a dove, but looks like a dove. We have to understand those texts when it says it looked like something, it's emulating something. But the Spirit descends in a soft, gentle way, like a dove might land on something, and then you hear this voice of God that's just speaking out about the scene that's taking place. I liken it to, if you've ever seen... what was the Jim Carrey? He was in that movie where he was in that dome and everybody watched his life. The Truman Show. You know, you remember at the very end where like he's out on the sea and all of a sudden the Creator begins to talk. You know, he doesn't even know where he is. He's looking up around and he just hears the Creator's voice. That's kind of like this scene here. Jesus is being baptized, the Spirit's coming down, and you just hear God speaking. Very, very dynamic, showing the deity of God. Then there's the thing about the power that he has over diseases. In Mark 1:40, it says that a man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you're willing, can you make me clean?" Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand, touched the man, which everyone knew was a no-no when someone had leprosy because now it's going to be transmitted. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cured. When you look at the miracles of Jesus, especially in his cleansing in the Bible, they're instantaneous, complete, and ongoing. They're lasting miracles. It's not like the miracles that we see today. Now, I don't want to downplay and say that miracles don't happen, because they do. And when we pray for God to heal someone, we fully expect that God can heal someone, or at least we should fully expect that God can heal someone. And so if that miracle happens, we attribute it to God. But I do have a struggle when someone says, well, I had some back problems and they prayed for me and I felt pretty good today. But they still have the back problem. Well, to me, that's not a miracle as defined like in the Scriptures. You know, they were instantaneous, complete, and ongoing. And so when someone had leprosy and it was gone, or Jesus puts the man's ear back on, or he brings back sight to a guy who was blind, or gives the mute the ability to speak, or the deaf the ability to hear, and it's all instantaneous, those are bona fide miracles that can only be attributed to God. And some of those things do happen, I think, today. You hear the story of someone who went in, they had the x-ray, whole body's full of cancer. Every doctor says it's full full of cancer. They pray, their people come around them, they implore God to move, they come back and get an x-ray, and there is no cancer, it's gone. And you can't say it's just a mistake of the x-ray machine, because you can look and see this tumor mass or something, and now it's gone. I think God moves in some ways. He does spare some of us some things. Not all of us, and probably not most of us. But there are times when he does that, we give him the glory. But Mark, the point is that Mark shows Jesus is exercising authority over diseases. He also has authority over demons. Mark will show more about Jesus and dealing with demons in his gospel per capita of writing than any other of the other three gospels. In Mark 1:24 it says, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," Jesus said sternly. "Come out of him." And the evil spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. Happens several times in the Gospel of Matthew where Mark talks about Jesus overcoming and demonstrating power over demons. And sometimes I think that we need to realize that there are two sides there are two extremes in our world today as it refers to demons. There's a side that there's a demon for every bad thing that happens. If I go out here and I got a flat tire, it's a demon of flat tires that's on my back. If I go out of here and I hit every red light, I got the demon of traffic on me, and I never can get anywhere. And I think that that's a false idea, that there's a demon behind every bad thing that happens. Sometimes we just live in a fallen world, and sin has its course, and it causes things to happen, and the nature is cursed and all that sort of thing. I don't think it's always a demon, but I do think that we have to understand there are demonic forces at work that cause things to happen, that can entice us in certain ways, that can do certain things. And I think for those who have allowed it, who do not have the Holy Spirit in them, I think there can be demon possession because it happened in the Bible. Now, I think there are things that happen with people today. We chuck it off as just psychiatric problems and things like that, and I think that there's a legitimacy to that. But there also might be some of those things, and I'm not saying all of them. I'm not going to all exorcism on here, but I do think there are some things, especially, and I would say only if they're not believers and haven't given their life to Christ, because I do not believe that a demon can possess a believer. There's no way that a demon can possess a believer. You read in the scriptures, if God is in us, then who's greater than him? And so I don't believe in that, but I do believe that there is demonic forces. And the reason I believe that is because I also believe in angels. Because the Bible talks about angels, messengers of God who do things. And demons are only fallen angels. Those who have sided with Satan, who have opposed God, who have been cast out. You can read, in Revelation where it talks about a third of the stars swept, and some think that's what a reference of that is, and whatever. We know there was this warring, and there's made a difference. And you cannot believe in one without believing in the other. You can't believe in light and not have darkness. You see, you can't have positive without negative kind of thing. And you can't say there's angelic beings, but I don't believe in demons. Well, they're real. Jesus dealt with them. He called them out. And if I believe in Jesus, I also believe in the forces that were working against them. And Paul, by the way, says, right, that our struggles are not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities and the evil forces of this world and that sort of thing. And we have to be reminded of that. Anyway, Mark shows that Jesus has authority over demons. He also shows he has authority over nature. In Mark 4:38, Jesus was in the stern and sleeping on a cushion, and the disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care if we drown?" Right? They're on the Sea of Galilee. Things are looking bad. Storms come up. He got up, he rebuked the winds, and he said to the waves, "Quiet, be still," and the winds died down, and it was completely calm. And it's not that we haven't seen winds die down and waters become calm, but we haven't seen that happen when someone stands on a boat and says, "Hey, shh, stop." And everything just quiets down. So Mark shows the supernatural powers of Jesus. Number 7 is this. Mark's gospel emphasizes more than any other gospel the miracles of Jesus. He records 18 of the possible 35 miracles recorded in the Synoptic Gospels. He is trying to show the supernatural ability of this man Jesus. Why? Because he wants this Roman audience to come to believe in Jesus as deity, not these false gods that are carved of wood and stone, and have these temples and everything that are not doing anything. But here is a person who was in flesh and blood, who ascended back to heaven where he came from, and he has asserted his power over all these different things, over nature and over diseases and over these supernatural things. And even the voice of God spoke when he was being baptized. Mark wants them to see all these great, powerful things about Christ. Number 8 is this. Along with a focus on the supernatural power of Jesus, Mark also focuses on the servant nature that Christ exemplified. This would have spoken well into a Roman audience who at this time, about half of the Roman Empire was in some sort of slave or indentured servitude. Now, not necessarily in the slavery in which we think of slavery, but they're beholden to somebody. Somebody's controlling their lives. Somebody has say over what they do. And so, by showing that Jesus is a servant first, and you can lead as a servant, it speaks to an audience of servants. You know, when you come into an audience, you want to, I've always been told, like when you go to a new place to preach, find out something about that audience and then speak on that level to that audience. So if you go to a farming community, throw out some farming analogies. I was plowing the field. I was taking in the harvest, because all those farmers are going to go, yep, I know what that's like. Plowing the fields, bringing in all the hard work. You know, if I go to the inner city, I'm probably not going to be talking about planting apple trees and things like that, because they're not going to understand that. I'll be like, you know, I was riding the subway and there were so many people crowded around me and someone bumped into me and I just thought, does anyone even care? You know, they're going to resonate with that. You know, that sort of thing there. I heard a preacher say one time, he was in my preaching class, and he was telling the story of he had a student who went down to Atlanta. He clearly did not know much about history, and he talked about Sherman's march to the sea and how he burnt Atlanta, and it didn't go well with the Atlanta congregation. So always know who you're talking to before you preach, all right? Mark 10:45, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Very key verse there. And that's why we talk a lot about servant leadership. There's different types of leadership. There's command leadership. General Eisenhower says, we're going to go on June 6, 1944, we're going to storm the beaches and we're going to take back the beachhead. That's command leadership, that sort of thing there. And then you have like servant leadership, like Martin Luther King. You know, we're going to sit here quietly at the counter here, and we're just going to be nice and try to just show that we can rise above all that. You know, you have the leadership. That was the leadership after Jesus. Be a servant. He's not commanding, though he could. He could command legions of angels to come down and do stuff, but he doesn't. He leads by example. And even the night that he was betrayed, he knows he's going to die, but it's like that last major event that he does in a servant way is he washes his disciples' feet. And then he tells them, now that I, your master, have done this for you and set an example, you should do this for one another. And so, great way of leading. The last one is this, number 9. The ending of Mark's gospel has brought about much scrutiny. You can read in your Bibles, there's going to be a little subnote there, or the remaining portions of that text are going to be italicized. Most biblical scholars will agree that verses 9 and following were added later in an attempt to tie up loose ends. However, the earliest texts that we have stop at verse 8. The problem with verse 8 is it seems like that it has just ended abruptly. Trembling and bewildered, it says the women went out from the tomb and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And it just stops. Well, that doesn't sound like it doesn't really sound like the ending of a major event. Here Jesus has been crucified, he's been laid in the tomb, and the women come up here and then they flee because the tomb is empty, and they don't say anything to anybody. Well, we know that there was more that happened after that, because Mary meets Jesus, thinks he's the gardener in there. Peter and John run to the tomb, find it empty, and then it starts to spread that Jesus is alive, right? And he's walking and meets the two on the road and everything else, and it moves on from there. That's why verses 9 through following, though the earliest copies we have may not have that, That doesn't mean that it's not there. It doesn't mean that it wasn't written. All it means is that the earliest copies we have do not have that. But we have later copies that have this in here. If you ever see how this stuff was done, and I have one in my office, a scroll that's rolled up and you unroll it like this, right? It's easy for an end to be torn off, especially when they were sewn together, for it to be separated. And for a page, if I were to just rip this page out of this book right here, and you were reading here, it would be like, what? It just sounds like it stops. I don't have to prove this is in there. All I have to do is say, is there a reasonable explanation of what might happen? And I think that you can make a reasonable argument and say the earliest copies that could have been torn off from some of the first early copies, they're all copied by hand. If that is lost and then additional copies are made, then it may not be copied in there. Then maybe someone writes down, adds to the Gospel of Mark because they hear Peter talking the rest of the story, and so they add to it. We don't really know. But the point of that is this: the remainder of the story that's in Mark does not contradict what's being said in the other Gospels. Jesus doesn't suddenly do something necessarily sporadic or anything. The thing that is in there that's a little scary is the handling of the deadly poison and those sorts of things there. That may have been written because they saw some of the early church apostles do things that were like this. Paul would be one of those. Remember, Paul was bitten by a viper and he didn't die. Right? He shook it off in the fire, and they started to pray because they thought, man, you're going to die, sucker. But he doesn't die, and then they thought, and so there were some of those stories that had gotten out, and that may have been what led the writing of this, where maybe Peter was sharing some other stuff, but that's kind of how that's in there. I don't die on that hill. If someone wants to take that out of there, I'd be like, that's okay. I still know who Jesus is. I know He died. I know He resurrected. I can't go back and answer every single question that someone has of the text, but I can answer enough of them to say, I can still see going down this direction. I still have enough evidence to bring me faith, even though there are some hiccups here. And I think that's an honest way to teach the text there, and just say, I don't have to prove beyond a shadow of doubt. I just have to give a plausible explanation. And I think that you can do that.